Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Well, hello, and welcome to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about Mark's Gospel, the greatest story ever told. The countdown has begun. There are only 4 more episodes, I think, after this one, if I've got my counting right. Then we're finished. Anyway, we're very pleased that you chose to spend a few minutes with us today and hope you'll feel it was worthwhile, and I'm sure you will. My name's David Payne. I'll be your host for this, the 64th episode in our journey through Mark's Gospel. And today we're delighted to have Dr Lucy Peppiatt with us. Lucy has been principal at WTC Theology since 2013, so for 10 years. You teach courses in Christian doctrine and spiritual formation. Have you written several books, most recently Imago Dei, I believe. But what I know, and I loved The Disciple, by the way, which is, I'm on a course, Lucy's actually my tutor, so I'll be introducing her to Steph in a minute. But what I notice about it is that you make theology practical, and it's not worth it if it doesn't mean something. So thank you for that. You and your husband, Nick, are, I think this is the founders of CrossNet Church, which has branches in Bristol and London. Is that right?
Correct, yeah.
And you've got 4 sons.
Yeah.
And 4 daughters-in-law. I'm sure I've missed loads.
No, and now 2 granddaughters, so that's lovely.
Oh, fantastic. And it's great to have you with us. I hope you enjoy the discussion. I'm sure you will. And Steph, I think we know everything about you, don't we? After 64 episodes, can you tell us something? Tell us, you're a former teacher. You now perform Mark's Gospel in many different scenarios, including the Edinburgh Fringe recently. Is there something our listeners might not know about you?
Only some very obscure interests and hobbies, David, such as I'm a Trekkie. Sorry about that, everybody. And also, I love disco dancing, believe it or not.
You don't?
I certainly do.
Well, I didn't know that.
Of mine.
Doing it or watching it?
Or both.
Okay, we'll have a demonstration later. Well, let's get on after that. That's the introductions over. Today's passage is the Crucifixion of Jesus. So this is a big event. And it's going to be read to us, as usual, by another Lucy Warner.
The Crucifixion of Jesus. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him.
Well, there's lots of detail to talk about in this passage and the literary structure and things like that. But after all the build-up with Jesus trying to explain to his disciples that he was going to have to die, and then in verse 24 it says, "And they crucified him." It's hard to overemphasize the importance of what's happening, isn't it, really? And I was reading it a few minutes ago, and it's just shocking, isn't it? And I don't know, what's the main point you would want to make about that, Lucy?
I think the whole of Mark's Gospel has this sort of power to it because it's so staccato. It doesn't have any flourishes, really. And we find that when we come to this passage. So it's like you move through so quickly all the events that in the other Gospels are sort of strung out a bit more and embellished, and he just seems to take you through at this pace. And the same with the crucifixion, although it takes up a lot of space in his Gospel, suddenly there's this kind of abrupt end. And I think that Mark brings us to the power of that, as well as not really allowing for any gentleness around the cross in any way. You know, there's nothing happened that alleviates the trauma and the stress of it, and he lets you experience that kind of the full trauma of it, with the emphasis on the mocking and all of that. That's what I find with Mark's Gospel.
Thank you. What about you, Steph?
Yeah, I agree with you, Lucy. I think the trauma is really elaborated on, isn't it? There's no sense of any mercy being shown. Even the wine and the myrrh isn't in itself really that merciful. And so, yeah, I mean, as far as the crucifixion is concerned, and as far as those words are concerned, I think the starkness of that sentence really does stand out, doesn't it? And it's not the sort of thing that if we went to see Mel Gibson's Passion, for example, the Passion of the Christ, we're not getting a detailed kind of elaborate portrayal of the actual wounds of Christ and all the whipping and the blood and all that. It's actually just down to a few words, and it is deeply shocking. I think for me, the greatest shock value is the fact that they're crucifying a particular person who in the rest of the Gospel, if we're paying attention, I think, is being revealed as the Son of Man, but also the clear sense, for me at least, is that Jesus is Israel's God in human form, walking the earth. And to say those words, and they crucified him, it's almost unbelievable that they would crucify God himself. But that, I think, is what comes across through the staccato that you mentioned, first of all.
Okay, we've got some questions from our lovely Facebook group. Feel free to go over the edges and to add to these and to make points you want to. But Gareth, our faithful questioner, I love it when people point out things I hadn't noticed. And Gareth just says, what happened to verse 28? There are some clues, I think, from our friend John in the Facebook group. But what did happen to verse 28?
Yeah, it's so funny that instead of changing the verses, they do actually leave it out and have 27 and 29. So you know something's wrong. So I think in all the Bibles that we have, there'll be, if verse 28 isn't there, there'll be a footnote to say that it was a verse that was included in later manuscripts. So there are many manuscripts of all the Gospels and the epistles that we have. And so this was deemed to be later. And so it would have been an addition or a gloss that had been inserted. But it's interesting because so the verse that was inserted or has been in some later manuscripts was and the scripture was fulfilled that says, and he was counted among the lawless, which is actually can be found in Luke 22:37. It's the same. So that's in Jesus's voice. It's his teaching to his disciples before his crucifixion in Luke. And it's really a warning. It comes in the mid. So the context different in Luke from it possibly being in Mark or being put in Mark here, because it's Jesus talking and warning his disciples, you need to get ready because I'm going to be counted among the lawless, and then you might be counted among the lawless. And so violence will come against you. So it's a kind of interesting that it was there, put in, and then taken out by by editors, and editors have to make these decisions based on the manuscripts they have in front of them, and what is they want to go to the most authentic, nearest the one that was first written.
Yeah, is it true there's a lot more manuscripts now that don't have it? That's because I never quite know what those footnotes mean, really.
Yeah, so I think generally it's a good sound process where these editors are looking at and making good and wise decisions in terms of what is plausible, based on what they know and the dating of the manuscripts and what might have been added by a later scribe.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that, Steph?
No, that sounds brilliant. Well done, Lucy.
You can go for the next question then. We don't always go through a question at a time, but it looks as though that might work today. So again, I think this is Gareth. Is there a reason for the detail that Jesus was offered wine mixed with myrrh? Mark likes his detail, doesn't he? And there's usually a reason. Myrrh makes me think of his birth, of course.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the allusion, because Mark doesn't reference any births at all in his story. But yeah, I think the detail may be because Mark is wanting us to think about what has just happened in the story, or at least happened very recently. Jesus has actually said at the Last Supper that he won't drink of the fruit of the vine until he comes into his Father's kingdom. And so his refusing it is Jesus actually refusing to basically upholding his vow. And I think it also kind of, because I should have explained that wine mixed with myrrh was meant to be a kind of act of mercy, because it kind of dulled the pain. I'm not sure how merciful it was really and truly, however, because the idea, I think, was to get the person who was being crucified blind drunk. But of course, he would often be on that cross for hours, if not days on end. And so he would recover from his drunkenness. He would have a hangover. And the result would be even more dreadful for him in terms of his pain than it would have been if he hadn't been drunk. So it's not necessarily that merciful. But going back to why Mark includes it, Jesus clearly, he takes the full weight of this trauma on his shoulders. There's no sense that he wants to lessen the pain for himself. And that, again, perhaps for us, indicates that his devotion to his calling, his love for us, that he would sacrifice himself to the utmost for humanity. I think that's quite important.
You want to add anything to that, Lucy?
No, I would concur with all of that. Yeah.
Easy questions today.
Can I return to another little bit that's quite interesting about, picking out something? Because as I said earlier, it seems to me this is a very stark portrayal. It's not detailed, really. It's got a few details, but mostly it's kind of very succinct, isn't it? But another detail, which I'm wondering what you think, Lucy and David, about, is this dividing up his clothes. They cast lots to see what each would get, and it's put in between two they crucified him phrases. So it's like a sandwich, a typical Markan sandwich. You've got he was crucified, and then they have that detail, and then they have the time of day, and then it says he was crucified again. So it's almost as if Mark wants us to focus on that middle detail. And I wonder what your thoughts were on that, Lucy. I certainly got a few of my own, but rather than just mentioning that straight away, have you got any thoughts on?
I have. I think that there's this really fascinating allusions in our passage that we're looking at today, and then carries on a bit further to Psalm 22, and that phrase that is exactly lifted from Psalm 22, verse 18. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. And Mark mentions it there in verse 24 and then Mark 15:29, we've got the thing of people shaking their heads, which is from Psalm 22 verse 7. And then of course there's Psalm 22 verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? So I think there are these very deliberate references back to the Old Testament that are lost on us as sort of Gentile readers, but I think people, the Jews at the time, would have known very well what Mark was alluding to. And this kind of thread that goes through the whole of the crucifixion account, that Jesus is being led to the cross according to the scriptures, you know, that there's something that he's fulfilling by doing this, by becoming this suffering servant that is foreshadowed in the Old Testament. So that I think that's incredibly powerful through this passage that we're looking at today.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. That's that reference to Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 is one that starts off with that cry, doesn't it? As you said, why have you forsaken me? But ends with a clarion call of victory that he has done it. So for those people who knew that psalm as they were listening to this particular story, it would have made sense to them that the crucifixion wasn't a disaster. It wasn't a defeat. It was actually a victory on God's part. So I think that's why it's most important. I couldn't agree with you more. I can't help thinking about the intricacies of the detail of the torture, though, in that if they divided up his clothes, that means they've ripped them all off. And I know we have it, you know, in our churches, perhaps, if we have a crucifix at all, Jesus would have a loincloth, but I think typically that wouldn't be the case, and that he would be absolutely naked. And there couldn't be a greater indignity. That was the point. They just wanted to humiliate as much as possible.
Yeah.
So Gareth again says, there seems to be a lot of detail or energy about how much Jesus was mocked, as you've sort of said that, really, I think, haven't you? Is there a reason for that? Why? Do you feel you just said that, Steph?
Yeah. Sure, you go first, Lucy, and I'll carry on.
Oh, okay. I would say yes, 100%. There is this emphasis in Mark's gospel of the constant mocking that comes from all quarters, you know, from the Romans and then the Jews and the bystanders and the criminals, you know. So it's like everyone around him is taking part in this. But what I notice most about it is that in the mocking is words of truth spoken out over him, you know. So there's this kind of deep irony that it's the mockers and the scoffers who seem to be demeaning and taunting, but in fact, weirdly in their mouths is all this truth coming out.
Yeah, totally right. And then I think the important point here is the main mockery is this. Well, one of the main parts of the mockery is the fact that he's King of the Jews. So even the strap line above his head is meant to be mocking. You know, Pilate is saying, "Oh, this is your king." It's ridiculous to think he is your king, and he's trying to expose Jesus as a terrorist. That's what Pilate's view is, and that the Jewish nation haven't got a hope in hell of defeating the Romans if this is the sort of thing they put up as their leader. So he's really going for it in terms of the mockery. But of course, from our angle and from what we know of what Mark's written so far, the King of the Jews is a particularly powerful description of Jesus. And I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Lucy, but I know there's a lot of controversy about it, but for me, the whole of this crucifixion narrative, even from the beginning of the chapter 15, it seems more like a coronation than it does even than an execution at times. So the culminating point is where he is stated as being the King of the Jews. And you have to ask yourself, what is Mark up to with this stuff about purple robes and crowns and kings and so forth? And it seems to me he's trying to emphasize something very important about who Jesus is and why he came. That this is the culmination of God's plan and purpose for humanity and for creation. What Jesus himself prophesies. He says to the chief priest, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of glory. And he does this several times actually during the course of the lead up to the crucifixion. And what he's referring to there is the book of Daniel, which talks about the Son of Man ascending to the Ancient of Days and being granted dominion and power and glory over the whole of creation. And so that's the allusion. And for us, if we were knowledgeable, certainly for those in the time that this was written, it would have been clear to them. This is a clear reference to Jesus being the Son of God, the Son of Man, the King. And rather than something to be mourned over, although of course it's a dreadfully shocking episode, it's actually a victory, albeit on very strange terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the chief priests and the teachers of the law call him the King of Israel.
Yeah.
So he, the Romans call him the King of the Jews, and they call him they say, the King of Israel. So I think definitely, I read an interesting little thing that they may have hung that placard around Jesus's neck.
Oh, right.
They might possibly have hung it over his head and have it hung round him, which would have been seen to be more humiliating. But that I don't know, it struck me as being quite a powerful possibility, that because everything about this scene is designed to humiliate him more and more and more.
Yeah.
But the fact that it was actually just on his body and on his chest made it more powerful to me.
I was hesitating about mentioning this, but I couldn't agree with you more. That humiliation is the key thing here. And I mean, in the next episode, there's this section where they talk about this staff and the sponge, and they offered him to drink it. It's not as it seemed. It seems to me, because the sponge was often used as a kind of a device you used in a latrine to wipe your bottom if you're going to the loo, and the soldiers would be carrying those things with them, and that's what was offered to him. I guess I want to return though briefly to the other mocking that goes on. Lucy, don't you think that every single word is full of irony, isn't it? That it's not just the kingship that's ironic. It's also the bits about saving yourself. He saved others, but he can't save himself. It's like, well, this is the truth, isn't it? That actually Jesus does save others, has saved others, and he deliberately doesn't save himself for that reason. That
he is the savior of the world, and that if he did save himself in that sense, he wouldn't have saved them. So I think there is something as well about the fact that they are all his detractors. They're all the mockers and the scoffers, including the thieves or the criminals or whatever, the dissidents who were crucified next to him. Because in Luke's gospel, one of them's a goodie and one's a baddie, whereas here they're both baddies. and I think that there is something in this gospel about the power of the crucifixion and the sacrifice of Jesus for those who hate him, that he comes to save everyone. He doesn't just come to save the good people. And in fact, if you're not a sinner, you have to know you're a sinner to be saved. And I think Mark is painting that picture really starkly, that Jesus knew how hateful humanity can be, but he still goes to the cross for all of us and for everyone, including those people. And that, I think, is a really, really powerful message.
I've never seen that before. I think it's wonderful, though, that, yeah, it is. It's likely that's the case. On the subject of the two robbers, or as they should be translated, rebels, because I think they probably were political terrorists, actually. It is interesting, isn't it, that they are said to be one on his right and the other on his left, which is a throwback to an earlier episode when James and John say to Jesus, "Can you do for us anything we ask?" And they say, "Can we sit at your right and your left when you come in your glory?" And Jesus says, "No, those places are actually prepared for others. It's not my place to give them to you." And now we see that's who he meant. And that means then that this scene, which we're witnessing, is actually Jesus coming in his glory.
All right.
And going back to that idea of the Son of Man coming to the Ancient of Days as the enthronement and the granting of authority, the bringing in of a new kingdom. There's something really, really powerful going on here, even though it seems the worst possible disaster. When I performed this, it's quite remarkable. As you said at the beginning, it's such a shocking episode. I've often seen people cry, openly. And yes, it is incredibly sad, but there's this beautiful, this wonderful revelation that's being given us here. That Christ has done something amazing for the whole of the universe. And what that is, it seems to me, and I could be wrong, I'm not really an expert on this, but in this passage, it seems to be Jesus, by his own death, has defeated death. That the enemy of man, the enemy of humankind, the greatest enemy of humankind, isn't even sin, it's death. And Jesus dies and he rises again. That's what the whole narrative's about. And that means he's defeated it. Amazing.
Yeah.
Go on, Lucy.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, that's what comes out for sure.
I think you've answered a couple of questions already there, but I really want to put Colin's last point and question, that clearly by the time John writes Revelation, it's a central theme. Revelation 5 reveals a slain lamb as the king of the cosmos. And so his question is the crucified God central enough to the church's teaching and praxis? I.e., do we truly imitate him? If the crucified one was raised above all in these days when truth and power seem more up for grabs than ever, is that a radical answer to light the way? And are we brave enough? I don't know who wants to take that. But
Well, I think he's touching on something very, very important. And I feel I'm entering this territory with great trepidation. If we're being asked to say what we think of the church in comparison to what the story seems to be suggesting the church should be like, that's a huge undertaking, isn't it? I'm probably not going to be going along as far as our questioner, because he's obviously thought about it deeply. But it does seem to me that the passage seems to cast a certain amount of responsibility on us. It's not just about Jesus, because Jesus has always said, right from the halfway point in this story, that if you want to follow me, you've got to deny yourself, take up your cross. And Jesus does what he says. If he obeys his calling, he denies himself, he takes up his cross, he goes to the most gruesome end because of his love for God, because of his love for us. And that's the kind of sacrifice God is after from us too, whatever that might mean. And it may mean physically, may mean following Jesus to his death. And that would have been the lot of many of the people who are listening to this story, probably. It is still the lot of those many Christians across the world who die for their faith. For us in the comfortable West, we're less we're less likely to have that happen to us at the moment. But there is a certain amount of dying going on, isn't there? That it's not about power, it's not about self-congratulation and adulation. It's about service. It's about making oneself low to bless others. That is what's required of us, and it's quite an awesome undertaking.
Yeah. Lucy, is there anything else that we haven't included? Anything else you wanted to say about the passage?
I think there's just an interesting difference in the time scale of Mark, when Jesus is crucified in the Synoptic Gospels and John. And that's just something which I think it's good to note, because otherwise people sometimes get thrown by things like that, why isn't it all the same in all the Gospels? And actually Mark's timescale works well for his account and works and is in line with the Synoptic Gospels, and then John has a different hour. So Jesus is crucified later in the day in John. And I think most people say that that's because John was making a kind of theological point with what he was saying. But anyway, I just think it's good to note these things and say that's what happens in the Bible. And it's like that sort of funny verse 28, it's like opening the door to behind the scenes a little bit, that the Bible tells us the same story in slightly different ways, but that the theological point of the story is exactly the same in all of the Gospels, that Jesus is the Saviour of the world and that his crucifixion was the means by which he saved us, and defeated death. And that's the main point.
That's brilliant, Lucy. I love that. And I think some people do get hung up, don't they, about the veracity of the Gospels, and when they see the differences they think, maybe these guys weren't telling the truth. Well, actually that's not what they were about. They weren't about necessarily reporting the facts as if they were writing journalism, but they're actually after something much deeper than that, aren't they? And they hold true to themselves. There's a coherence in all the Gospels. That's brilliant.
You want to add anything else, Steph?
Oh, I just want to mention one more. Lucy, when we were talking about this before we started recording, you mentioned the phrase "see and believe," and I thought it might be worth talking about that. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, just that when I was rereading Mark for today, I just thought about this whole theme of blindness, which is such a prominent theme in Mark's Gospel, and seeing and not seeing. And I thought that it sort of culminates in this scene that we've been looking at, where the only people who speak to Jesus or speak about him are people who can't see who he is and who don't understand what's before them. And, and the teachers of the law and the chief priests say, "Oh, give us a sign, and then we'll see and believe." And that's what they've been saying all along. And he's kind of like, "I've given you every single sign, this is the final sign." And so that's the real irony that is deep in this text, is that Mark's showing how they can't see, but they actually do see, because in their mockery of him, they're revealing something about them, and something about him is that how he reacts to them, how he goes through this crucifixion in the face of this just horrific opposition to who he is, but then he is going to come out victorious from that and be seen for who he is, that he will be seen as the Saviour of the world, who ironically they kind of see and don't see and don't believe. But then this is the means that Mark uses to show us the good news and teach us about Jesus. And that is a profound kind of, in a way, a literary device, but it's very deep in what the Spirit is doing through it.
I love that. And the phrase just before that is also, I hadn't realized this until just the other day when I'm looking at this passage for this podcast. Come down now from the cross. Okay, so it's mocking Jesus. Come down now from the cross that we may see and believe, as if Jesus couldn't possibly come down from the cross, which he doesn't. But of course he does. He may not come down now, but in a couple of days' time, he will indeed. And that is the call for us as we look at this event and as we think about the resurrection, which goes along with it. What's our response going to be? Are we going to see? And if we are going to see, are we going to believe?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Lucy Peppiatt, thank you so much for taking your time to join us today and share your thoughts with us. It's been a real treat to be involved in the conversation. And we've enjoyed having you with us too, lovely listener. We hope you'll check out the website, iam-mark.com, and the Facebook community. Do also look at the WTC Theology website, where there's a podcast of their own. We've got loads of, there's 20 or something editions that I last looked, and I've listened to some of them, and many free resources as well as courses. That's all we have time for today. So thank you very much, Lucy Peppiatt. Thank you very much, Stephen Smart, and from me, David Bain. Goodbye until next time.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stephen Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. And this is the greatest show.